Hi everyone, so this is the first video in our new topic of Australia's Federation. Now some people call the Federation of Australia the birth of a nation, but we know that Australia was much more active before 1901. So in this video we'll briefly introduce the topics that we might talk about in detail a bit later in other videos. So firstly we'll talk about the spread of British settlement and the impact of British settlement. We'll also talk about racial attitudes, so how European settlers treated other people from other areas that moved to Australia. We'll also talk about life in Australia in the 1800s. We'll also mention democracy in Australia, the process of federation, and some of the early laws that Australia first brought in when it initially federated. So firstly we'll talk about the spread of British settlement after the initial colonising stage. Further exploration of inland Australia, particularly with the crossing of the Blue Mountains by Wentworth, Lawson and Blaxland, opened up new land for settlement, and this was necessary because they needed more land for farming. And then with the introduction of the assisted passage scheme, this encouraged more people to move and immigrate to Australia, so there were more free settlers to Australia, and there were particularly more skilled workers who could help develop the colony. Furthermore, further inland and coastal exploration led to new colonies outside of New South Wales, including South Australia, Queensland, Victoria and Western Australia. Now, the impact of British settlement did impact a particular group badly, and we know that the Indigenous Australian population was impacted quite badly by the arrival of the Europeans. Terra nullius meant that there was no recognition of Australia's original owners. Because the Indigenous weren't using the land for formal farming, that meant that the British did not recognise that they were the owners of the land. And they suffered greatly in the settlement years because they were driven off their land, they had restricted movement so they weren't allowed near the European settlements, and they had a strong sense of loss because sometimes they couldn't access their traditional lands or sacred sites, so they had a strong sense of loss. Furthermore, disease went through the Indigenous population very quickly, particularly with smallpox, which the Indigenous people were not immune to. So during the settlement years, Australia had many European settlers who had very strong racial attitudes. They strongly identified with the British Empire, being that that's where they originated from, and they believed that the Anglo-Saxon race, so the European English people, was superior in every way to any other race. And many groups, because of this, were denied rights and freedoms before Federation in Australia. So there were actually other people aside from British people living in Australia, and that included Chinese people who came to work on the gold fields during the gold rush, South Pacific Islander people who moved to far north Queensland to be labourers on the sugarcane fields. There were also Afghan people who were cameleers, so they brought camels to South Australia, and Japanese pearl divers who worked as indentured labourers in Western Australia. Now these people experienced Australia in a completely different way to British people because they were not considered equal and they were denied rights and freedoms that British settlers had. So of course Australia in the 1800s is very different to what it is like today. Gold rushes in the 1840s and 50s developed cities very quickly, and Melbourne, because it was close to Ballarat, which was the site of a very large gold rush, became Australia's largest city very quickly, and it also became the second largest city in the British Empire after London. Now, because of this rapid growth, living and working conditions were poor. People who were unskilled workers were forced to live near their work and walk to their workplace and work really long hours, and because of the rapid growth it increased crime rates and poverty rates as well. After the gold rushes there was a long boom, so a period of economic high between 1850 and 1880, and it brought some improvements. So working conditions improved, wages improved, and for a while Australia was known as the working man's paradise. However, the 1890s brought a period of economic depression that forced many to head to the bush, and so many people moved away from the large cities and began agriculture and farming activities. Now, Australia is actually known for a place that was quite advanced with its democracy. Prior to Federation, the 6 Australian colonies were some of the most advanced democracies in the world, and most had their own parliaments with full male suffrage. That meant that all men who were citizens could vote, and also parliamentarians or members of parliament were paid, and that was unusual for this time period. And one of our great achievements was that in 1894, South Australian women became among the first in the world to receive the right to vote, and so many countries didn't follow for many years after. So after the 1800s passed, it was decided that Australia would federate. So all 6 colonies completed referendums. That means that all people with voting rights were able to vote whether they wanted to become separate from the British government. And it was voted in 1900 that showed that all Australian people wanted to federate and split from the British Empire. This was supported by the government of Britain, and they brought that into law on July 5th, 1900. So Australia became a nation on the 1st of January 1901. So early laws that were passed with the new government that was born on the 1st of January 1901 were primarily concerned with protecting Australian racial purity. They wanted to keep it as Anglo-Saxon as possible. So policies such as the White Australia Policy, the Immigration Restriction Act and the Pacific Islander Labourers Act ensured that only British immigrants would be welcome and have full rights in Australia. Apart from that darker side of the early laws of Australia, there were some positives. Early laws included laws that cared for less fortunate citizens. So initial laws were laws that allowed for elderly and disability pensions, and also injury compensation for those who were too sick to work, and maternity leave of £5. So to sum up what we've talked about in this video, Federation in Australia's early identity was shaped by British settlement. We were primarily dominated by British settlers, and so that shaped our early identity. The 1800s were a time of boom where working conditions improved, and also times of hardship where people were forced to move to the bush because they couldn't find employment in the big cities. Australia has been since this time known as an icon of democracy because we were one of the first places to allow women to vote and to have paid parliamentarians, but unfortunately we are known for our early racist attitudes, which made it difficult for people that weren't Anglo-Saxon to feel welcome and have equal rights here. One of our good reputations from this time is that we're renowned for looking after our own less fortunate citizens because we have had pensions from early on, we had injury compensation and even maternity leave from early on. So I hope you enjoyed that video about Australia's Federation. It's just a brief introduction to what life was like just before Australian Federation. The next video will focus on a more in-depth look at the expansion of Australian settlement and the impact that posed for the Indigenous population. If you get a chance and you're a bit of a science nut, head over to my colleague's YouTube channel. His name's Jeremy Lacornu, and I'll put the link in the description box. And I'll catch you next time. Bye!